welcome everybody. Today we're going to be discussing a topic that I found super interesting, but also kind of a little overwhelming. So I'm really excited to have some experts on the line with us today that can tell us a little bit more about artificial intelligence and also how we can use it in developing countries. So I think it's easy to see that perhaps some of the big corporate giants are like Apple and Microsoft and those guys are using, but how can we in our own countries and in our own companies maybe, make use of this amazing technology and enhance what we do. So a couple of housekeeping things before I introduce our panelists for the day. So quick reminder, we will be recording today's session and distributing the recording to you guys either tomorrow or the day after. And also we want to hear from you. So although you guys can't actually physically talk, we can hear your questions by the Q&A function. So if you have any questions for today's panelists, please do pop them into that Q&A and we'll get round to them as we sort of get towards the end of the webinar. So feel free to use that. Today we are joined by Sam and Susanna from the GSMA, who've been doing a lot of research on artificial intelligence and how it's basically working and being applied across developing countries. But we also have Kate from Nvidia and Shagan from Jomo, and they are going to talk a little bit more practically about what's going on. So some of the conversations and questions we're going to be exploring today are, what level of uptake and traction are we seeing in using of AI in developing countries? What are the emerging trends and most common use cases of AI in financial services? And also, of course, exploring some of the challenges and issues that people face along the way. So I hope you'll all find this an interesting conversation. I certainly can't wait. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to start off our conversation today. Over to you, Sam.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks to the Digital Frontiers team as well. And thank you all for joining us on the webinar. As Sarah said, so I'm Sam Ajadi. I am a Senior Insights Manager at GSMA. And I'm joined with my colleague, Susanna Ackland, who will be taking you through our research on AI in developing markets. So in terms of structure, we'll start off with a 15-20 minutes presentation on our findings, on our research. We'll then jump into the panel with Kate and Shagun. And after that, we'll open up to Q&A to you guys, to the Q&A. And we will then, I think the questions we'll be exploring involve some trends, challenges, opportunities, some of the ethical issues around AI as a technology. Next slide, please. So for those not familiar with the GSMA, GSMA is an industry body for mobile operators. So we represent the interests of mobile operators globally. We work with 750 mobile operator partners, uniting them with 400 companies within the broader mobile ecosystem. And so these include device makers, big tech companies, internet companies, and companies within the more adjacent industries. Within the GSMA, next slide, is our Mobile for Development, which essentially brings together our mobile operator partners, the broader mobile ecosystem industry, and within that, uniting those with the development communities. So think DFI, donors, startups, and ecosystem builders, tech ecosystem builders. Before jumping into the research, we would like to thank our members, the GSMA members, for the continued support, and also our key informant interviewees for this research pieces, for taking time out for listening to us and answering questions around sort of the challenges and trends within AI. Would like to also thank the UK Aid for funding this research paper, and it's worth noting that the views expressed does not necessarily reflect the UK government's official policies. And we'll also finally thank Urban Emerge. They worked with us on this research paper. We actually mapped out 450 AI startups in alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll just introduce the research briefly on the next slide. yeah, so we mapped out 450 AI startups in alignment with the AI Sustainable Development Goals. And our focus was on Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, right? And what we were trying to understand with this is what are some of these key challenges? What's the progress, promise, and perils as we've put in the report? And also with that, we wanted to understand the business models around AI as a technology. How are people making money with this technology? What's the sustainability, and what are some of the ethical and barriers and other challenges involved? So on the next slide, we'll start off with a business model. As you know, monetization is critical for any business model. We found that the two main ways to monetize AI, both in developing markets and even more broadly globally. The first is the indirect, right? So this is when companies are monetizing AI as part of their products and services. And so we call this AI-enabled companies. And the first of these are companies, and I think AI-enabled, when it's done well, you don't see the AI, right? So it's usually on the back end. These companies use AI to enhance their offerings. And this could include like an advanced machine learning technology and algorithm on the back end. When we think of AI enabled, it could be a recommendation engine. And so an example that will resonate with many people globally is Netflix. On the back end, you see a recommendation engine that suggests what TV shows and movies you could watch. Now there's a predictability element of the back end, and that's backed by AI. An example that I'll give you in Africa is Curacao, which is one of the case studies that we have in the reports. And Curacao is an insurance tech company which uses AI to help insurers optimize their claims and claim processes. They also help reduce payouts to fraudulent claims as well. And so on the surface, that's what they do. But on the back end, you then see that there's a use of natural language processing to interpret this data. The company processes client data, understands patterns, identifies fraud. So what we found is with AI-enabled companies, it's the revenue streams is typically like any other traditional software company. And so as I said, on the back end, you then have a recommendation, engine or a feature, for instance, which is either AI or machine learning enabled. The other type is what we call the AI first companies. And this is essentially an AI as a service platform. And these companies really enable companies and governments to acquire these highly sophisticated capabilities with some investments. So it could either be through a subscription or a user-based mechanism. So essentially, the value of the solution is the pricing of the technology, and it's the pricing of the technology is implicitly connected to the value of the solution. We also looked at the consumer segments. What we found is that many AI-enabled companies make use of focus on B2C solutions, whilst AI-first companies really focus on either the business to business, so B2B, or business to government, so B2G solutions. And what we found when we were asking companies, the question is that the AI first companies tend to, the B2B and B2G companies provide better opportunities for initial cash flow. And that's one of the drivers for AI companies to focus on this region, on these section. The third element we looked at is outlook. And really here, it's the questions around dynamic regulatory environments and industry trends and outlook. So I would skip over that and I'll let you read through that in the report in more detail, but I'll jump into the next slide. So what we looked at is we looked at the geographical reach of these companies. We wanted to understand where are startups, where the most activities happening with startups and AI in developing countries. And what we found out is that India has such a strong proportion of the overall developing markets. And in our sample for 450 startups, 180 use cases were achieved in India. And think about how high this percentage is. And what we found is with countries that have a high proportion of these companies, AI companies, they tend to have a top-down approach to engaging with AI technology. And what they do is that there's actually set up from either the government really prioritizes this technology, understanding the potential of AI for the future of the country. And that's what we've seen. If you look at China, which is not included in our research, there's a lot of focus where there's this huge amount of patents and governments actually playing a key role in driving this AI initiatives. And I'll just move to our next slide, please. So what we found in terms of distribution sectors, business intelligence and analytics were clear leaders in our research, followed by, we see healthcare, and then as you see on the chart, we have food and agriculture and financial services, right? And the different use cases that we explored across these sectors, and we have detailed case studies in the report. But I could briefly touch on maybe healthcare, because it's a leader because of just the huge amounts of data that it's included, from patients' data to just broader health systems data to healthcare workers. So there's so much data in this space as well. Financial inclusion, which would explore in a panel with Shegun and Kate, has a vast amount of data as well. So we'll just move into the next slide. So here is really the focus on the capabilities that we saw in AI. So I wouldn't expand more on this. We have a more sort of detailed description in the reports, but maybe a few insights that I can touch on is that just deep learning platforms were the most prevalent of these technologies. And one thing that we found particularly interesting is that we have several startups that are exploring more than one of these capabilities across Africa and Asia, which is something that we're keeping a very close eye, watching very closely. So with that, I will hand over to my colleague Susanna, who will take you through some of the trends that we're seeing around AI and SDGs, the ethical challenges, and we'll really just touch on funding use cases and other barriers as well. Over to you, Susanna.
Thanks, Sam. So continuing with some of the key points that Sam's already raised in the research, we found that AI is contributing to all of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And the most significant contribution is to decent work and economic growth, which is SDG 8, and also SDG 9, which is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. We also found that there's a really strong focus on food and agriculture, which is 1 and 2, and that's particularly in relation to poverty reduction and climate smart agriculture. Many of the solutions across all of the SDGs contribute to financial inclusion, whether that's directly through financial services specifically, or whether that's indirectly through improved livelihoods overall. So moving on to funding, interestingly, within our sample, most of the funding is directed at financial services, and that's followed really closely by food and agriculture, and then healthcare and business intelligence and analytics. social services sector, we've seen funding come in for people like One Fight in Nigeria, who have raised 6 million, SME Corner in India raised 50 million, and a company called Happy in India also raised 70 million. But of course, we're lucky here on this webinar to have Segun from Jomo, who also recently raised 55 million. So I'm sure he can speak much more about that later. So yeah, reminder, do put any questions that you might have for Segun in the chat around that, because I'm sure it'd be great to hear more. So when looking at funding from capital partners or venture partners, accelerators, foundations, our research revealed that India is a really clear leader. Kenya, Malaysia, Thailand, and South Africa, in terms of funding volume, are next. And then that's followed again by Tunisia, Nigeria, and Indonesia. But we should say that with these results, the funding data out there is really, really limited. So this is only quite indicative. It's also worth mentioning that lots of companies and organizations that have raised significant funds have benefited from having multiple partners or funding sources. So moving on to the next slide, it's nearly impossible not to talk about COVID-19. And of course, this has had a really huge impact, as we know. It's had a negative effect on the global economy and people and businesses all over the globe. But the disruption from COVID-19 does actually also present governments and companies and organizations in lower and middle income countries with some opportunities as well. It's become clear that the digital economy is being accelerated. So thanks to a shift in online communication services, I think we've all had to get quite used to using remote working platforms as an example, because of reduced contact. And within this accelerated move to digital, in many cases, AI itself has actually had a really positive impact. So just as an example, we've seen governments automating parts of their COVID-19 response to improve public access to healthcare information. We've also seen ministries of health have partnered with local partners, creating chatbots that can respond to questions on WhatsApp, and just generally disseminating information. There's quite a high chance as well that even though COVID will hopefully subside, that a lot of this innovation could be here to stay. And technology companies can actually really maybe take advantage of the increased attention the digital economy is getting at the moment, and specifically the potential of AI coming out of this crisis. So governments are going to have to work hard to keep up with demand for decent policies, but this could present a really big opportunity to harness this really quick shift into digitization and the fourth industrial revolution, as I'm sure you've heard it being called before. So now I'm just going to touch briefly on some of the barriers and challenges to implementing AI. The first one, if we look at barriers, is availability, accessibility, and the quality of data. And this is, of course, crucial to train algorithms really effectively. And in less digitized environments, such as in low middle income countries, there's much less data actually available. And so less effective practices means that data can be uneven or inaccessible. On human capital, while there is a lot of growing access to upskilling and training in AI, many countries do still lack a really steady pipeline of homegrown talent and skilled AI development talent. Successful deployment of homegrown AI-based services does require very specific skills, whether that's preparing data and training machine learning, or developing or launching and maintaining new apps. And in our research, we found that the lack of mentorship available to startups who are developing AI-based solutions is quite a severe constraint in lots of countries. There's also concern about automation and how that will affect jobs, whether that will mean that jobs become automated and people are worried for losing their jobs. And that can then snowball into uncertainty and fear around actually adopting AI at all. We've also seen, unsurprisingly, a lack of investment, particularly in low and middle income countries. This can be quite limited. There are a few other barriers to consider, like digital inclusion, reliable and affordable internet, human capital, and also the transferability of AI solutions when applying them from different contexts. But I think for more fine detail on these, I'd urge you to find them in the report, because I don't want to keep you here for hours. If we look at the second box on the slide, ethics, AI does hold significant potential for good, but there are some ethical considerations that need to be considered so as not to cause harm. There are many ethical considerations about data protection, ingrained bias because of poor data collection, social inclusion, and just the responsible use of AI overall. But to highlight some of the key principles, we identified a number, and here they're listed, so I'll just run through some of them very quickly. Be inclusive is one of them. So AI stakeholders need to ensure that the benefits of their AI-based technologies are accessible. Being fair. So AI systems should incorporate human oversight. Data needs to be accurate and not biased, and make sure that it doesn't make unfair or discriminatory decisions. Ensuring transparency is also really crucial. So this means that individuals need to be informed when they're actually speaking to an AI-powered system rather than a person, which is quite common in chatbots. But the other aspect of this is that decisions that AI make need to be explainable to the impacted individuals. And we found that people are very less likely to accept decisions, especially when they're decisions about themselves, if they know that an AI has made it without being explained how they got to that decision. Accountability, so all stakeholders should be really accountable for the use of their AI and should promote these principles with third parties. Adopting privacy and ethics, and also doing that by design, is a really crucial element. So AI systems should incorporate privacy and ethics within the design process and ethos at every stage of the life cycle. And that part's the part that's really crucial. So not just when, the whole solution's been developed, the whole principle is that privacy and ethics really need to be integrated throughout the entire development stage of any solution. There are actually currently over 130 privacy laws in effect around the world. And this concept of privacy by design is embedded now in many of those laws. And so moving on to the next one, advancing security and safety. So access to AI systems and their data should be controlled and subject to audits like normal accountability measures. And also AI solutions should really try and support sustainability and social well-being. Environmental sustainability and societal well-being are very important and really must be taken into considerations, again, throughout the whole development of an AI solution. Ooh. So, thank you very much for listening. For more on artificial intelligence in low and middle income countries, and to read more about some of the research that we've been doing at GSMA, you can read the full report, and you should be able to get access to that through the link on the screen, and also through the QR code, which should be there as well. Or equally, you can find it on the GSMA Mobile for Development website. So I'm now going to hand back over to Sam, who's going to have, I'm sure, some really insightful conversations with our panelists.
Great, thank you, Susanna. So we'll jump straight to the panel. Thank you, Kate and Shagon. I think to just start off, maybe Shagun, we can kick off with you. Could you briefly tell us about Jomo and how, are your companies using AI in the financial services space?
Yeah, thank you, Sam, and thank you for that summary of the report. I think it's pretty useful when you put it that way, because I've tried to read through, but just picking out the highlights is quite helpful. So hi, everyone in the audience. It's a pleasure to join you today. My name is Shagun Adeyemi. I'm the country manager for Jomo in Nigeria. So Jomo is a fintech company. We've created a full stack technology for building and running financial services essentially. And what we do is we use big data, machine learning, AI, all those things together just basically to increase financial access, to drive inclusion on the continent and in other emerging markets where we operate. And the thinking for us is that if you can access a mobile phone and you can access a mobile wallet, you should be able to have access to basic financial services. So like things like loans, savings, insurance, and many more, it shouldn't be a big deal. And with this, so far we've made some progress in that regard. We have, we're currently live in 7 countries, 6 of those being in Africa, and Pakistan as well. We've disbursed for our credit business over $2.6 billion. We've served about 18 million customers, in all these markets. And the reason this is possible is because of the use of, AI, machine learning, and which is basically the conversation we're having today. So, speaking specifically to how Jomo uses AI in our processes, I would speak from the perspective of how we integrate it into our credit model. So essentially, for us, data is the engine, with which we drive all our business proposition. So what we do is essentially to partner with the largest sources of data, in the markets that we operate. And what we've found over time is that tends to largely be the telcos, that's the mobile network operators. So we're partnered with some of the biggest telcos, the likes of MTN, Tigo, Telenor, Airtel. And we integrate directly into their systems to get access to a large chunk of data. So, within our ecosystem, we're seeing over 10 billion rows of data, which is really massive. And then we run this data on our, advanced data engines, and we're able to use machine learning and artificial intelligence to deduce behavioral patterns. That gives us insight into, eligibility, like, is this somebody that does this behavior that we're seeing, does it suggest that this is somebody that is credible to be given a loan? We also use it to determine things like pricing, what rates should we offer to this customer? What kind of terms should we give to them? And, all the general features that we use in designing our credit products. And the good thing about this is that, with this, we're able to make an informed and, automated decision instantly and do it at scale. And then, because of the large amount of data that we're injecting, we're able to get an improved scoring system, an automated system. We're able to get an improved portfolio performance. And as a result, we're able to get better returns that we can then pass on back to the customers, use that to drive down the price and also increase the pool of customers that are eligible. So with this, these are customers that typically, because some of them might not even be in the formal financial services space, the traditional players are not structured or are not best suited to serve them. Either they don't have the, some of the KYC requirement, or they are not within that ecosystem. But because of the approach that we've taken and, the fact that we're able to leverage on, some of this AI systems, then we're able to reach out to these customers and serve them, and also, just increase the reach of financial access in the markets that we operate and that we're looking to operate. So I'm just going to stop there for now, and then we can then dig deeper into the conversation. Thanks.
Great, Thank you for that, Shagun. That's really clear. Kate, could you give us a quick introduction as well and share some of the initiatives that Nvidia is working on? Nvidia is known as the largest AI company in the world, so it'd be good to find out more about the initiatives and developing markets initiatives as well.
Sure. So thanks for the overview of the report. It's a report I had the chance to read a couple of months ago. So really, really interesting for me, interesting insights. And also thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be on that webinar. So like you mentioned, Nvidia is one of the largest AI company in the world. Our core business is actually around GPUs. So GPUs are hardware systems that can be used to process and build AI applications. They have enough computing power to do so. But we don't only make GPUs, we also make a lot of software. Our mission is really to democratize AI. We want to make it accessible and useful for anyone, including people who do not have an engineering background. We want to make it easy to get started. If you ask me what a vision in an ideal world, what that would look like, I would say that even a farmer in Kenya could use one of our GPUs to optimize workloads on his farm without even knowing a single line of code. Right. So in an ideal world, this is what it looks like. So that's kind of my mission at NVIDIA as well. And this is the reason why I was hired a couple of months ago to go and drive this and really accelerate this and accelerate our reach in emerging markets on one side, but also with emerging applied AI use cases. So if I look at the current initiatives that we have ongoing for low and middle income countries, my first open and honest answer would be we do not have specific or dedicated initiatives to tackle gross markets like low and middle income countries. But it's coming. We're working on it. We're fixing it. And it's coming more on this at our GPU technology conference next month in April. We have a bunch of announcements specifically dedicated to Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, all low and middle income countries upcoming. But other than that, we have current initiatives which are not addressed to only more developed countries, but also emerging. We're actually trying to address the full spectrum of the ecosystem, because what we realized is that whenever you're trying to expand the reach in AI, you need to do it at multiple levels. You need to do it first at the national and country level. So we have an initiative called AI Nations, where we're working with the UN, where we're working with governments at country level to understand what is their AI strategy, how we can help them frame the strategy around technology, infrastructure, data, sustainable use of data, ethical use of data, how we can help them deploy the necessary infrastructure to help accelerate economic development in their countries, right? So that initiative is called AI Nation. We also look at it from a startup perspective, because a lot of the innovation is coming from startups like Jomo as well, for example. So we have an initiative which caters directly to startup, and we have a bunch of startups from low and middle income countries. So that program is called Inception. But we also have catering to students, universities, and anyone who really wants to upskill themselves from an AI data science deep learning perspective with our Deep Learning Institute. And we also, of course, address the applied AI research community. So for us, it's not just a one-size-fits-all type of model. We're really trying to address the whole ecosystem and make sure that this ecosystem work together for at the end, create solutions which are beneficial for the countries, for the developers, for the startups, and really accelerate, bring everybody on that AI innovation journey.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful, because I think tying in what you just said with what Shagun said, like you know, NVIDIA takes more of a very top-down approach, but also a bottom, you know, working with governments, but also a bottom-up where you're working with startups, you know, other companies, and also you know, students in universities and you know, in colleges. So that's really helpful. Shagun, I'll just move over to you again. What trends, you know, and common use cases are you seeing within financial services? I know that Jomo is active in this space, but what what are the key trends that you see within the space?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the most common one, which is really the one which is in the space where we play, is really in the retail and commercial lending space. Even in your report, where one of the companies you featured was OneFi, who also play in that retail space. So what we're seeing is, we're seeing the AI use case in the automation of the entire process, from origination to disbursement to collection, and this is possible not just even for retail, but also even for commercial loan as well, because of things like companies are beginning to use things like capture technology, advanced analytics. Then they have more robust prediction, scoring, and decisioning engines. And a lot of these things are largely driven by AI. So that way the uptake within that space has been pretty accelerated, especially more so recently, where we're seeing even traditional financial institutions beginning to also adopt some of these technologies to drive, to create new products and just increase their reach, and also like to go into new segments that would help them compete with some of the upstarts and startups in their space. The other one also is that if you look at a few years back, there was a trend of chatbots in financial services. Everybody wanted to do everything with chatbots. It sort of has tempered a bit, because then you had all the banks in Africa launching their own chatbots, and it was the wave of the moment. But I think while that has scaled to some point and the trend has sort of settled a bit, what we are seeing is more mature use cases for chatbots beyond just send money to family and friends. We're now beginning to see a lot more advanced use of chatbots in things like robo advisory, for asset management. We're seeing it for people using it to even generate insights, to provide very tailored investment advisory, and even for personal finance as well. So that's another one that has that is emerging very quickly, where the use case is not just at a very rudimentary level of just send one to send money to family, or send to buy airtime. And also, if you look at the area of KYC onboarding, just at the origination level across the full spectrum of financial services, we are also seeing that using the likes of natural language processing, data extraction models, we're beginning to see companies put that into their KYC and onboarding processes to also better automate that, and also even to check for fraud at a very early stage, to identify patterns that could potentially expose them to risk, and they're able to do this in a way that they couldn't do it at scale before, or for them to do it, they had to have very robust manual processes that are most times not cost effective. And that's something also that we're beginning to see. So you see that across the continent, a couple of AI-driven KYC and onboarding companies, and some of that in their use cases, they're even extended even to compliance, because some of those technology capabilities are similar. So what they do is just to create the different use cases and leverage on the trend, and so that's also another one that I'm seeing. An interesting one also that you mentioned is even in the insurance space for claims management. One of the companies you spoke about is Curacell, which is the company of a very close friend of mine. When I was just saying to him that he's supposed to be on this call because he was featured in the report, but that's a company I'm also close to. So I know that they're also, doing a lot of fraud detection in the insurance space, leveraging on AI. And that trend is not just something that is happening in emerging markets, because, some of the things they are even exploring is to even see how they can apply that in more established insurance markets, even in more developed countries. So yeah, those are some of the key ones that comes to mind now in terms of what we're seeing in the financial services space. And I think from here, it's really going to just get more accelerated as the as everything gets, more digitized, because this is inevitable, largely also accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, so it's interesting times, and it's good to see that there's also a lot of work that is being done by the likes of GSMA, Nvidia, and, other stakeholders as well, just to increase participation and capacity in that space to even further entrench those trends.
That's really interesting. I think, noting that we're seeing AI and machine learning active across the spectrum, of financial services. It's, from like KYC at super early stage to even reaching the end user, so it's a really interesting trend. Kate, back to you. Shegun just mentioned some of the trends within the financial services. Could you give us, your view on some of the latest trends and, emerging areas that you're seeing in the more broader AI space?
Sure. So from an emerging area or emerging use cases perspective, I think Shegun covered pretty well the financial space, but there are a couple of other things that come to my mind. So whenever COVID hit, of course, we saw an abundance of companies starting to use more and more AI to protect, detect COVID-19, isolate the COVID genome. So I think one of the big trends in healthcare is going to be around biotech, genomics, using AI for all these types of workloads. There is, of course, agriculture, which is becoming more and more pervasive lately. But one of the big trends I'm currently exploring and I'm fascinated about is around using data, climate data, using Earth observation data, using space data, and trying to understand, to cross it with population migration and understand how climate change is influencing population migration. Could we use satellite imagery and population census data to extract more insights around healthcare, around employment, around electricity, power management in low middle income countries? These are kind of the things I'm looking into, have been looking into recently. Could you use climate data to predict the likeliness of flooding in southern Malawi, for example? All these type of insights, really where we have data existing, but we haven't in the past really thought about applying AI to this type of data. But really, any data that can be used, we are able to drive insights out of them. The other way I look at it, and as I look at the trends on top of from a use case perspective, is really from a market perspective. Where are going to be the latest innovations? Where are we going to be surprised? And from my personal perspective, I would say it's going to come from low and middle income countries. One of the things we've seen is that whenever the big AI boom happened, it was driven out of different actors in different regions. If you look at the US, it was driven out of big tech companies. If you look at Europe, it was driven from data policy like GDPR, for example. If you look at parts of the world like China, it was driven by the government incentivizing startups to go and build an AI industry locally, right, in China. But if you look at low and middle income countries, it's all coming from innovation from startup. It's a grassroots bottom-up innovation. And I think as they are trying to solve challenges which are around them, which some of us in the US, in Europe cannot see, we're going to start being more and more surprised by the type of solutions that they're bringing to the table. So looking at it from a more applied AI perspective rather than a pure technology standpoint perspective. And one of the things we often tend to forget when we think about AI is that actually AI and technology is just an enabler. It's an enabler to solve challenges which are around us, right? So if you equip developers with everything they need to go and unleash their innovation and just focus on that and focus on solving the problems which are around them, they're going to come with innovation you haven't even thought about. So these are kind of the two ways I look at it. On one side, from a use case perspective, definitely looking at the everything that's happening with climate and earth and space, but on the other side, looking at it from a market and where the innovation is going to be driven in the future. And I think this is going to come from low middle income countries.
That's massively helpful. I think there's so much we could explore on this topic, but I'll hand over quickly to Sarah for audience Q&A. See if we have any questions.
Thanks so much. And I think it's no surprising to know that one of those questions or several of those questions are related to data. And I think you know, where that data comes from, how that data is used, are always going to be some interesting questions. So let's start there. We have a question from Alex Walker, who's asked, do you find that people's level of trust in data stewardship and their willingness to share personal details is higher or lower in developing markets in compared to the higher income? Anyone likes, Sam, maybe that's something, did you find anything like that in your reports?
Yeah, so what we actually found when we interviewed startups, so we didn't actually interview end users for this research, we think that would be a fantastic research to do. If there are any gaps, it'd be good to speak to people that are leveraging these services. The trends that we see, depending on countries, is that startups in in parts of Africa and Asia tend to, a lot of the times, the AI and machine learning is actually built in. The ethical considerations is not always built into the design. So it seems like it's an afterthought of designing the solution, right? But when you see companies that are abiding by best practices, they tend to lean towards abiding by the GDPR data management approach from Europe, or they know that if they're going to seek funding, companies that are more advanced, some of the questions that the venture capital or investors will be looking at would be, is this ethical? Is this ethical use of data? So that's what we found. The more advanced companies, the companies that are leveraging these solutions, really consider the end user at the center of their solution. So it's by design. The ones that are not so advanced, more early stage, don't do that, unfortunately. And I think there's some work to be done there.
Great.
Yeah, if I just chime in very quickly to say that Sam spoke to something very important, and just to speak from the context of where we are at Jomo, maybe we are not much of a startup anymore. Just considering some of the kind of backers that we have that are very institutional. For us, that's like very, very absolutely dependent on data. So we have to be very responsible stewards to people's data that they have in the highest levels of data security, data privacy, ensuring that we're compliant, not just at the local level in terms of the territories where we operate, but also compliant to global and international standards of data privacy. I think those are things that become extremely, extremely important. And the other thing also worth adding is that there's also the bit of data consent before you start to use things like personally identifiable information of people. So you have to design in a way that the customers are aware, and it's easy for them to agree and be informed that their data is going to be used for these purposes and these ways. And of course, if the use case or the product you're offering to them is compelling enough, and you've shown enough transparency, then I think what we see is that up to that extent, the customers are pretty open and are more willing, and they get more comfortable. But once it looks like you're trying to hide things or you're being shady, that's where it sort of gets tricky.
And Shagan, you kind of answered the beginning part of Michael's question as well, but his second part of this question was, so obviously you're obtaining and using data with the big MNOs like MTN. How do you do that? How does that commercial agreement work? Are you able to just give a little picture? Obviously, not getting anything too much away.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's about alignment of incentives, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about the capacity that we have built and the mission that we are trying to drive. At the end of the day, it's about enabling the customer. It's about, bringing products that drive economic growth, that drives prosperity, in the markets that we operate. So if there's alignment of mission, and commercially, you're given the big MNOs, and the corporate companies the opportunity to also participate in things that, even though they also have some capacity, but they don't have the type of capacity that we have developed. And, because data also builds on data, it's a learning and it's an IP play. So the more data you have, the more you learn, the more you get better at it. The more you're able to predict with, higher accuracy, the more you can bring down the error rates. So it's an entrenched mode where everyone is aligned and everyone is incentivized to play their role, and everyone is bringing something to the table. So it's a conversation where everyone appreciates the value that the other party is bringing on board, and therefore it makes the conversation pretty straightforward. Where once everyone is aligned at the early stage, then there's that willingness for them to share the data. They know the data they have is valuable, but they also appreciate the capacity and the technology that we also bring to bear. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah. And GSMA, in addition to Shagan's point, GSMA has actually done, there's a team, one of our teams, Ecosystem Accelerator, have done some work on these synergies, building synergies between mobile operators and companies, innovative companies. I'll share that report in the chat, and feel free to follow up if you want more information.
Perfect, and we'll also share a link to that in the email that we send out with the recording as well. I think we've got a question connected to that data. So from Jill Shemin. So she asks, many of the phones in Africa and Asia as well, I guess, are not the fancy smartphones with all of the tech in it that we would like to see. So, are we still able to get data? What kind of, is that a challenge? What data are we talking about? And here that, and are there challenges of that? And maybe, I don't know, Kate, should we come to you?
Sure. So true, most of the phone right now in Africa are feature phones, but we see a trend accelerating where we're moving from feature phone to smart feature phone and then to smartphone, right? This is accelerating really quickly, as much as the access to connectivity is increasing across the continent. So from a apps perspective, we've seen a couple of startups coming up with apps which were designed for smartphones which were adapted to local usage, designed differently with different applications, with different features. So the market is adapting, but you're absolutely right. There is still a lot of the population which relies on feature phone. And on that end, using the data that we're already starting to somehow gather and be able to use to drive insights around consumer behavior, what they're using the phones for, whether it's for financial access, whether it's for healthcare, whether it's for digital identity. We've seen a couple of companies coming up, a couple of startups coming up with solutions in that space, is actually helping us paving the way from when that switch full or partial from feature phones to smart feature phone and smartphone is going to happen. It's greatly accelerating. It has been accelerating, I think, for the past year or two across the continent. And I'm pretty confident that as we are moving towards creating more applications which are serving the communities in low and middle income countries with smartphones and with phones in general, we will be able to harness and really be ready for that switch to happen over the next few years.
I mean, I just really have to jump in here because I think Kate is very spot on. I totally agree. We are also seeing that as well. But why I had to jump in is because we, by default, when we started and even up to this point, a lot of the customers that we serve don't actually have smartphones, so our money. So what I just wanted to add to what Kira said is that there's, even at that point, there's actually data. It just depends on what kind of data and what kind of insights can be generated from that type of data. So for us, it's also sort of like the deciding factor for who we choose to partner with, because even though we already have a strategy that is absolutely aligned with smartphones, because that is definitely the future and the trend is accelerating, but we also know that there's still a huge chunk of customers who are still using these feature phones, or these phones that don't have the type of capacity. So it's about, despite that, what can we do and where can we find data that would still be useful for us to create value for the customers. And of course, we hope that, very quickly, with all the efforts from multiple fronts, that the acceleration to smartphone would be improved. And that way it helps us to even offer higher value products to these customers, because there's also there's richer data you get when people have smartphones. There's, a lot of things that are enabled just by virtue of the variety and the quality and the advancement of data that you have with smartphones that you might not get with the current feature phones. But yes, this data is just about where those data sit and how you're connecting it and what you want to use them for.
And Kim Fei's asked a linked question to that. So what are the alternative data points to be considered in a market where perhaps the typical sources of data are not available or not accessible? Any thoughts from anyone on that one? Sam?
Yeah, I could chime in on this. I think I was going to echo Segun's points in that any if you have a solution where you can gather mass amounts of data. So if you look at mobile money, for instance, like understanding the use cases and how a typical user is using mobile money, you could use that to predict whether to lend or not to lend, right? We're seeing a mix of people pulling in population data, using some of the points that Kate was making around using spatial data, a merge of population, mobile data, and layering that on each other. You can actually use that to predict pretty insightful, pick up key insights about individuals and whether on how they make decisions. And that's where AI can come in to create efficiency.
Sam is actually pretty spot on. As much as there is a lot of data available for a specific segment, if you cross everything together, you're able to extract even more insights, and insights that you didn't even dream about. So when I was mentioning spatial, climate, Earth observation, think about this abundance of data, environmental related data, and cross it with population related data, and think about figuring out over the past 10 years how a population in a certain country or a certain city has evolved, and how the environmental changes have influenced that evolution. So there are a lot of things that, as we move towards really congregating all these different pockets of data that we have, some new insights, new sorts of application will be able to be created. And I also want to mention that there is an apparition of new startups which are actually trying to provide opportunities to people in low and middle income countries to be part of this AI revolution. And these are the startups, the data gathering and data tagging startups. So you can be anyone, take a picture of your environment, tag it. So if I take a picture of a car next to my house, I would tag it as a car and then send it. And it's kind of a gamification type of AI and data application, which allows people to also be remunerated based on their contribution, right? So we're seeing new ways of gathering data, fun ways, but also ways where the broader population who hasn't been educated on AI can actually get involved and be part of this application building process.
That's amazing. Thanks for sharing that, Kate. It's exciting how, you know, we can get so much, you know, information and insights. The more data, the more information we have, the better we can make decisions or use that data appropriately. And I guess, you know, I'm coming back to your sort of trying to wrap up our discussion in some way, coming back to Shagan, how you said like AI has enabled Jomo to actually target customers who would normally have not been able to access that savings or loan or insurance product, actually, that because it can work so quickly and at such scale. And although obviously a lot of cost is involved initially, once it's there, the cost to the user kind of, you know, allows you to reach perhaps other, you know, the kind of populations, the underserved populations that many organizations are not trying to reach. I just kind of want to touch on Ashtri's question, which is, you know, how can AI and how can all of this help in particular reduce some gender inequality that exists out there? So it would be great, perhaps Shagan, I'll come to you first, and then Kate, and then Sam to wrap up. So Shagan, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, so it's pretty interesting because that's a statistic that we actually, you know, monitor just to get a sense of the level of diversity within our reach. So we actively monitor the gender distribution to just see who are the type of customers that we're serving. And it is interesting that, you know, about 51% of our customers, you know, are female. So that's, you know, the first thing that I think it's what's calling out. And it's also, you know, speaks to the fact that, you know, AI can actually drive gender equality, especially in this use case, because these are people who, you know, because of the category and the segment that we are able to reach. The formal sector is more biased towards men, you know, by default, just because, you know, we live in a world where more men control the economic value generally than women. But because, you know, the decision is being made by, you know, his objective is being made by AI. It's not like, you know, a friend or someone. It's strictly by virtue of, you know, the transactions you're doing, how you're using your GSM and all that. So, you know, with AI, you know, that bias is sort of taken out, and it's really based on the data and the insights that we have. And because, you know, a lot of women are participating in the informal sector, you know, disproportionately so than even in some cases the men. So with the use of AI, that is something that is really entrenched, and that is something that is being driven. But I think even beyond just for us alone, the objectivity that sort of comes, which is also why it is important to ensure that you train your data to watch out for biases and to ensure that it is fair. You know, this is something that because you're really automating the entire process, with AI, AI doesn't care much for this person being male or this person being female. It is about, you know, what has been trained, what is the objective you're trying to achieve, what is the outcome you're trying to get to, and then you provide the data that suits that. And, you know, largely the data continue to show that, you know, in the case of credit, that women tend to actually even be better borrowers than men, even though, you know, in the formal institution, men tend to get access to more credit and more financial services. And of course, because, even from a savings perspective as well, we're seeing a similar trend, and even more beyond that, the ability to participate in formal financial services has significant ripple multiplier effects for these people, because it's not just about them getting a loan now, but because they can now access a loan, or because they can now save, they can now put better structure in their business, they can grow their business, they can, start doing more trade, so increase the level of participation, they can contribute more in their household or send their kids to school. So the outcome has been largely positive, and I think that it's something that, in aggregate sum, even if you check the data outside the financial services space, I'm sure that there's a lot of examples that we'll be able to point to in terms of AI enabling and, driving gender equality.
Thank you, Shagan. And maybe Kate, you could give us some insights on what's happening beyond the financial sphere.
Sure. So financial is definitely one of the big ones. But if I look at something like identity, for example, there are still millions and millions of people who do not have formal identity card like you would see in the UK or in other countries. So there's a big trend around how do we make sure we enable these population to have access to somehow digital identity. Digital identity through biometrics using AI has been something that has been explored and is still being explored by a couple of startups I've seen in the landscape. But what they've done, and the reason why I'm mentioning them, is because they first targeted women. Women are the demographics which is the most impacted by the lack of identity. And they first started by impacting women by looking at hospitals and looking at women who were going in countries in parts of the world, going to give birth, going to take care of their children, bringing their children to care, and they were first targeting these women who didn't have access to a lot of technology. Most of them were using feature phone, didn't have access to smartphone, really living in some remote parts of the world, in India, in Africa. And they deployed a large scale digital identity program using biometrics, using voice recognition, to start providing these women something that they didn't have before, and making sure that as they were benefiting from care from the petitions and also for their children, everything was recorded. A lot of these parts of the world still have paper records when it comes to healthcare, something that's really difficult to transfer if you move from one city to another. So this is one example where AI has really pushed forward in helping reduce that gender inequality gap, helping catch up. But then if you realize, if you take digital ID as a starting point, and then you add on top of that financial inclusion, you start with digital ID, I have an identity, now I have access to financial services, and all of a sudden I'm able to slowly catch up with the gap that has been created by society over the years. So the answer to this question is really AI is not the one answer, but it is contributing in some ways and in different parts of the spectrum to reducing that gap. And I'm hopeful that we'll keep seeing applications contributing to reducing that gender inequality gap, especially some of these startups focus on the SDGs.
Great, thank you so much, Kate. And I'm just going to pop over quickly to Sam and Susanna just for final thoughts before we wrap up today's session.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Shagan, Kate, and Susanna. I think on the question of gender equality, I think it pays to invest in women, and what we've seen is, if you look at just on the numbers, about 49 to 50% of the global population are female, and so what AI can then bring in efficiency. One of the use cases I was going to mention was actually in hiring, and there are tons of use cases around this. And what needs to be considered is that AI needs to be used with care, it should be used. It should be by design and shouldn't be an afterthought. And that's when it's most useful for driving innovation, both in developing markets and globally as well. So I can end on that note.
Thank you, Sam, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I think that's one of the concerns we saw in some of the questions. And generally, when we talk about AI, is the ethics involved, and is it done equitably, fairly, in an inclusive way? So I think that's a good thing that, as you say, by design, if we start off thinking that way, then the use of AI can be incredibly helpful to reach an awful lot of people that currently we're not able to include in financial services. Through things like loans, credit, in digital identity as well. So I've really enjoyed today's session. Thank you so much, Kate, Susanna, Sam, and Shagun. We've had a lot of questions come in and we haven't got around to all of them. Apologies, and we've overrun a little bit too. I'm sure we could continue debating and discussing this for many months to come. Perhaps we need to do a follow-up discussion later on this year as well. But thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you to all the attendees. And I look forward to seeing you all on a webinar again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.